She only had 5 crumpled dollars. But when that little girl handed them over for a wounded Mustang, no one in Dry Creek knew the storm that was coming. Why would a 10-year-old risk everything for a broken horse? And what secret did that Mustang hold that would shake the entire town? Watch till the end, because what happens in the final race will leave you breathless. Would you have done the same in her place? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories like this one. The sun baked the horizon in golden heat waves as Dry Creek, a forgotten speck of a town in southern Nevada, breathed its usual dusty sigh. The streets were mostly gravel, scattered with aging pickup trucks and the occasional barking dog. Summers in Dry Creek didn't just burn your skin, they burned through hope. The air was dry and restless, the kind that made old wooden signs creak even when there was no wind. 10-year-old Sierra Mayfield sat barefoot on the steps of her father's sagging front porch, watching ants crawl over a cracked soda bottle. She had a wiry frame, sun-tanned skin, and a mop of wild blonde hair that never stayed in one place. Her eyes were sharp hazel with flecks of green, and always watching, always dreaming. Sierra didn't smile much, but when she did, it was like someone turning on a porch light in the middle of a storm. Sierra lived with her father, Luke Mayfield, a once-respected rodeo cowboy who now struggled to find work fixing fences or breaking horses, if any still came through town. Luke was in his early 40s, tall with a weathered face, salt and pepper stubble, and shoulders that sagged like the beams of the house they barely managed to keep. He had a quiet demeanor, often lost in thought or memories of the rodeo days before Sierra's mother passed away during childbirth. Since then, grief had settled into his bones like old dust. That morning, Luke had gotten word that Doyle Hanser, a local landowner known for his greed and foul temper, was letting people scavenge wood from one of his abandoned parcels. They needed lumber to patch the roof before monsoon season. Sierra went with him, hoping to find a piece of wood that looked like a pirate sword. She always found magic in broken things. They drove for 20 minutes past the outer edge of town, where the land became a sea of cracked earth and stubborn sagebrush. Doyle's property was barely fenced, just a crooked line of barbed wire sagging between splintered posts. Doyle himself was already there when they arrived. Doyle Hanser was in his late 50s, balding with a thick belly and the permanent stink of tobacco. He wore sweat-stained overalls and boots so caked in mud they looked like they hadn't been removed in years. His face was angular and cruel, with small eyes like dull marbles. He didn't greet them, just pointed toward the collapsed barn and grunted something about not taking the copper pipes. While Luke headed off to load planks into the truck bed, Sierra wandered past the barn's shell, something catching her eye near the far fence line. It looked like a pile of trash at first, twigs, rope, and dirt clumped against the base of a wooden post. But then it moved. Sierra stopped cold. It was a horse, a Mustang, lean and wild-eyed, with a coat the color of smoke and ash. The animal's left front leg was swollen and trembling. A long, angry gash ran across its flank. It was tied loosely to the post with a frayed rope that had already begun to wear through its mane. The Mustang looked up at her, not with fear, but resignation. He wasn't wild anymore. He was broken. Sierra stepped closer, heart pounding. She had never seen anything so proud look so defeated. The Mustang's ears twitched, but he didn't pull away. His breathing was shallow. His ribs pressed hard against his skin, and one eye had a milky spot, like it had once been scratched or burned. "Hey, boy," she whispered, barely above the rustling of dry weeds. "What happened to you?" "Dumb thing got caught in the wire," came a voice from behind her. Doyle Hanser stood nearby now, chewing a toothpick, hands on his hips like he was surveying garbage. "Been limping around ever since. Can't sell a horse that don't run." Sierra turned to face him. What's going to happen to him? Doyle shrugged. Coyotes, probably. Or he'll die thirsting. Not my problem. Unless you want him. Her mouth fell slightly open. What? $5, Doyle said with a chuckle. You give me $5 and he's all yours. Not worth a cent more. That horse is done. Sierra didn't think. She didn't need to. She reached into her jacket pocket, the one she kept her freedom money in. Quarters from lemonade stands, crumpled ones from helping her neighbor sweep their garage, $2 bills her mom once left in an old photo album that Luke had finally let her keep. She counted it quickly. $5. Exactly. She extended her small fist and opened it. Doyle blinked in surprise, but then grinned wide, snatching the bills. Suit yourself, girlie, he said, already walking away. He's your problem now. Sierra turned back to the Mustang. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from something electric. She untied the rope slowly, whispering to him with every movement. You're not trash, she murmured. Not to me. The horse didn't fight, didn't try to run. She didn't know why, only that he didn't. From a distance, Luke stood frozen, watching his daughter lead a limping, battered horse away from the fence line. He opened his mouth to object, then stopped. He hadn't seen her look that sure of herself in years. Sierra brought the Mustang to the truck, whispering softly as she walked. She didn't give him a name yet. That would come later. He didn't know it yet, but he had just been given a second chance. So had she. The ride back to the Mayfield homestead was silent, except for the occasional clatter of hooves against the truck bed's metal floor. Sierra sat beside the horse, legs dangling off the edge, one hand resting on his flank. The Mustang didn't look at her. His head hung low, and his breath came in slow, shallow huffs. The sun had begun its descent behind the cracked mesas of Dry Creek, painting the sky in bruised hues of purple and orange. Dust curled up behind them like a fading memory. Back at the house, Luke Mayfield guided the truck around the back of the property where an old corral and lean-to shed still stood, half forgotten from his rodeo days. Weeds had taken over the fence line and the water trough was dry. He climbed out slowly, rubbing his knees, which always ached after long days in the sun. Gonna need to clear this out if he's staying, Luke muttered, mostly to himself. He didn't protest Sierra's decision earlier, though the worry still hung in his voice. I'll clean it, Sierra said, hopping down and brushing the dust from her knees. I'll fix the water too. He's mine now. Luke studied her. How serious she looked. How her hands shook just slightly as she reached for the rope to lead the horse down. He didn't argue. He just nodded and disappeared into the house. It took nearly an hour to coax the Mustang into the shed. He limped badly, favoring his swollen leg, and stopped every few steps. Sierra was patient. She didn't push or pull, only whispered. By the time they got him bedded in a makeshift pen lined with hay and an old blanket, the sky was deep with stars. Sierra brought out a chipped bowl filled with oats and a bucket of clean water. The Mustang sniffed both, but turned his head away. He didn't trust it, didn't trust her. She didn't mind. I'll call you Ash, she whispered, sitting cross-legged outside the shed. Because you look like smoke after a fire, and because you're still here. Ash flicked one ear, but didn't move. Inside the house, Luke sat at the kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee and a stack of mail. Most were bills or foreclosure notices. One yellow envelope caught his eye, the government agriculture program he'd applied for months ago. A chance at a grant meant for families keeping heritage breeds or restoring traditional farming methods. He opened it with fingers stained from old leather work gloves. Denied. Lack of documentation. Incomplete property condition report. Luke exhaled hard and slumped back. The house groaned in the night wind like it too was tired of holding on. The next morning, Sierra was up before the sun. She tiptoed past her father's room, careful not to wake him, and grabbed the basket of old carrots from the fridge. Ash was exactly where she'd left him, curled near the shed's corner, eyes open and watchful. She sat on an overturned bucket and began to hum. Not a song, just a soft tune her mum used to sing while brushing horses. "You're not alone," she told him as she tossed a carrot near his front hooves. Ash didn't touch it. By the third day, Sierra was pulling weeds from the corral, filling the trough, and reading aloud from a book about horses she borrowed from the school library. Ash still didn't eat much, but he was standing more often. He no longer flinched when she entered the shed. That afternoon, Luke brought home a surprise. He had borrowed a trailer from a friend and came back with a half-rotted bale of hay and an old saddle draped in canvas. Behind him was a woman, Sarah Lawn, the town's only veterinarian. She was in her mid-40s, tall and lean with sharp cheekbones and kind eyes hidden behind dusty aviator glasses. Her voice was brisk but never cold. She wore denim jeans, a white t-shirt stained with iodine, and a weathered ball cap that said, "Support your local barn." Sarah had once been a rodeo medic, but left the circuit after her brother died in a bronco accident. Since then, she'd kept mostly to herself, running a tiny vet clinic with 2 goats, a blind cat, and a reputation for patching up anything with a pulse. "You're the one with the Mustang?" she asked Sierra as she stepped down from the truck. Sierra nodded. "His name's Ash." Sarah followed her to the shed, her gaze scanning Ash's posture and the way his leg dragged when he shifted. "Looks like he tangled with barbed wire," she said, kneeling carefully. "Could have gotten infected. Let me see, boy." Ash tensed, but didn't bolt. With slow hands, Sarah unwrapped the makeshift cloth Sierra had tied days earlier. The wound was swollen, but not septic. "He's lucky," Sarah murmured. "He'll walk again, but he needs real care, not just hope." Sierra flinched a little at the tone. Luke spoke from behind. "We're doing what we can." Sarah gave him a look. Not harsh, just honest. "You'll need antibiotics. I'll leave some, but if that leg doesn't get better in a week, he won't be good for anything." Before she left, Sarah handed Sierra a short spiral notebook. "Start writing down what he eats, how he moves, anything weird. Healing's a partnership." Sierra took it with both hands like it was a sacred text. That night, Luke stared at the grant denial letter again. He couldn't let the house go. And maybe, just maybe, Ash was more than a sick horse. Maybe he was a sign. The government might have said no, but there were other ways to prove value. If he could show they were preserving something real, something wild. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old folder with faded pictures. Photos of Sierra's mother in her rodeo days, on horseback, competing, smiling. Among the pages was a registry paper, proof she'd once trained horses classified as Mustang Heritage Line. Luke's hands trembled. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. By the week's end, Ash had eaten 3 carrots, nudged Sierra's elbow once, and let her brush the dust from his back. He still limped, still flinched when the wind slammed the shed door, but he no longer watched her like a stranger. He was remembering something. And so was Sierra. The canyon just west of the Mayfield homestead was a place locals barely acknowledged anymore. It was a narrow cut in the land-red stone walls, rising like cracked clay sculptures, where wind whispered through cottonwoods and dry grass danced in silence. For Sierra Mayfield, it became her secret cathedral, a place where time slowed down and the world outside the failing house, her father's distant gaze, and the creeping worry about money couldn't reach her. She started taking Ash there after the second week. The Mustang had begun to move more confidently, favoring his front leg less, though his steps were still uneven. He let Sierra lead him without tension in the rope, and once, after she'd unlatched the gate, he followed her without it. No bribe, no carrot, just trust. It was that morning Sierra knew it was time. She packed an old saddlebag with a tattered library book on horse anatomy, a cassette player that still worked if you hit it twice, and a few of her mother's rodeo tapes she'd found in a dusty box under the stairs. She didn't tell Luke where she was going, only left a note on the fridge taking Ash for a walk. Love you. The canyon floor was dry but soft with silt, and the shadows of the cliffs made it cooler than the scorched land above. Ash didn't flinch here. He walked at her side like he belonged in the silence. They settled near a flat stone ledge where Sierra laid out her belongings. She hit play on the tape. Her mother's voice crackled to life, warm and full of grit. Don't pull on him, lean with him. He wants to know you're not just in charge, but in tune. Sierra closed her eyes. The voice was like a ghost she didn't fear, guiding her hands as she touched Ash's neck, the way her mother had shown in those old videos. The main storyline was simple. Sierra, through quiet determination and patience, was learning to listen. Ash, in turn, was beginning to respond, not like a pet, but like a partner. But something had shifted in town. Word travels fast in a place like Dry Creek, especially when it involves something rare. And a wild Mustang that followed commands, healed clean, and had the right bone structure that was rare. Doyle Hanser had heard whispers down at the feed store. A trucker had stopped in for jerky and mentioned seeing a grey horse moving like a shadow down in the canyon. Said it looked almost trained. Doyle didn't like mistakes, and he was beginning to suspect he'd made one. At the heart of his rotting ranch house, Doyle flipped through a half-empty filing cabinet until he found a wrinkled document, a loose record of stray livestock that had passed through his property. There, in faded ink, was a note. Unclaimed Mustang, grey, injured, tagged left ear, assumed feral. He grinned. If he could prove the horse had value and hadn't been properly relinquished, maybe he could get it back and sell it. He picked up the phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Meanwhile, Sierra and Ash returned from the canyon just as the heat started baking the land again. Her cheeks were flushed, and her clothes clung to her with dust and sweat. But her eyes were bright. Ash had followed her the whole way back, no rope. Luke stood on the porch, arms folded, watching them. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. That night, after a dinner of reheated beans and toast, Luke pulled an old camcorder from the hall closet. It hadn't been used in years, but after some fiddling, the red record light flickered on. "Let's show 'em," he said, holding up the camera. "Let's show them what he is." Sierra lit up. Over the next few days, father and daughter filmed Ash walking, responding to commands, even trotting across the clearing near the shed. Luke documented everything: the gentle strokes, the trust, the change. He planned to send it with the new application he was preparing for the Department of Agriculture. But before the tape could even be mailed, the trouble came to them. It was a Wednesday when Sheriff Colby Reams pulled up to the Mayfield house in his aging Ford Crown Victoria. He was a stocky man in his early 50s, with a silver moustache and a tan that came from chasing cows, not vacations. Colby was known around Dry Creek as a fair man, but he was a stickler for rules, especially when it came to property. Luke stepped off the porch, dusting his hands on his jeans. "Afternoon, Sheriff." Colby tipped his hat. "Luke, Sierra around?" She's with Ash. That's why I'm here. The sheriff explained that Doyle had filed a formal complaint, claimed the Mustang wasn't lawfully transferred and still technically belonged to his ranch. He wanted an inspection, a review, and if needed, seizure. Luke's face tightened. He gave her that horse. Took $5 for it. I know, Colby said calmly. But he's claiming the animal wasn't legally his to give. Says the horse had a tag in the left ear federal, which might change things. Luke didn't answer. He turned and called into the backyard. Sierra appeared moments later, wide-eyed, Ash behind her. Colby approached slowly. He squinted toward Ash's ear. The tag was gone. Torn during the injury, likely, but the faint scar remained. That scar's no proof, Colby said. We'll have to look into it. Sierra stepped between the sheriff and Ash. He's mine. Her voice was steady, but her lip trembled. Luke placed a hand on her shoulder. Colby hesitated. I won't take him today, but be ready. We might have a hearing. As the sheriff drove away, Sierra turned to her father. He can't take Ash. Luke looked toward the shed, then toward the canyon beyond it. Then we fight, he said. The courtroom in Dry Creek wasn't much more than a converted post office with creaky floors, buzzing ceiling fans, and walls painted a color that didn't quite commit to beige. The benches were hard pine, and the judge's bench stood elevated by 2 bricks and a small wooden platform. But for Sierra Mayfield, it might as well have been the Supreme Court. The day had started early. Luke wore his only clean button-up shirt blue plaid, faded at the elbows, and Sierra wore her Sunday dress, a yellow cotton thing with lace sleeves she hadn't touched since her mother's memorial. Ash stayed behind in the corral, Sarah Lorne checking in on him while they were gone. They weren't alone. Word had spread about the hearing, and curiosity drew in half the town. Among the onlookers were farmers, mechanics, and even Millie Decker, the cafe owner with a red beehive of hair and a reputation for shouting during bingo night. Millie was pushing 70, short and feisty, and came to every public hearing for entertainment value, as she liked to say. Today, though, her sharp eyes kept glancing sympathetically at Sierra. At the plaintiff's table sat Doyle Hanser, dressed like he was going to a funeral. Black vest, clean jeans, and hair slicked back with too much oil. Beside him was Travis Binns, a lawyer from the next county over. Tall, reed-thin, with rectangular glasses and a smirk that seemed permanent, Travis had a voice like sandpaper dipped in syrup, charming, but unpleasant. Presiding over the case was Judge Everett Lane, a man in his 60s with a gruff face, thinning white hair, and a voice that cut straight through nonsense. Known for fairness, but not patience, Judge Lane had once fined a preacher for wasting court time with a stolen chicken dispute. As the hearing began, Travis rose. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Hanser, seeks to reclaim a piece of valuable livestock, a wild Mustang, unlawfully removed from his property and now held by the Mayfields. We assert ownership based on these documents, he said, holding up a thin stack of faded papers. Luke stood slowly. Your Honor, my daughter paid $5 in good faith for that horse. The man sitting there accepted it. There were witnesses. Judge Lane raised a brow. You got a bill of sale? Luke's jaw tightened. No, sir, but there were words exchanged, and the horse was given willingly. That's not quite the same under Nevada livestock law, Travis interjected smoothly, especially if the animal in question has a federal tag. Sierra watched quietly, fists clenched in her lap. Her mind flashed back to Ash's tired eyes the day they met, the way he hadn't resisted when she untied him. He had chosen her. The judge looked down at the papers Doyle provided, flipping through them. These are barely legible. That's his signature on the bottom, Doyle pointed out. And this tag number, was it ever reported to the Bureau of Land Management? Lane asked. Travis hesitated. We're still confirming that. Luke stepped forward again. Your Honor, my late wife worked with Mustangs. I found registry papers connecting her to horses bred from heritage lines. Ash could be one of them. We're working on getting confirmation. Do you have it now? Judge Lane asked. Luke shook his head. Not yet. Silence. The judge sighed. Look, this is a mess. On one hand, a horse clearly in poor condition, sold off for pocket change. On the other, a child who gave everything she had to rescue him. But the law's the law. I'll need to review this further. The words hit Sierra like a stone. Review meant delay. Delay meant risk. If Doyle pushed hard enough, he could take Ash before they had a chance to prove anything. After court, Sierra and Luke walked out into the blazing afternoon sun. The heat was relentless. Sierra didn't say a word until they reached the truck. Are we going to lose him? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Luke didn't answer. He just opened the driver's door. Back at the house, Ash nickered softly as they returned. Sarah was waiting near the fence, arms crossed, stethoscope around her neck. He's healing, she said. Not perfect, but he's getting there. Sierra climbed through the gate and threw her arms around the horse's neck. They want to take him. Sarah frowned. Hanser? Sierra nodded. We don't have proof yet. The judge didn't decide anything. Sarah hesitated. Maybe there's another way. Luke raised an eyebrow. Another way? Sarah looked at them both. There's a competition in 2 weeks, out in Sierra Verde, an open run for rescued Mustangs. If he competes and places, he's considered a proven work animal, value certified, public record. That carries weight in court, sometimes more than papers. Luke looked at Ash, then at Sierra. He's barely healed. He'll be ready, Sierra said. Sarah met her eyes. It won't be easy. He'll have to trust you out there. No ropes, no reins, just instinct. Sierra didn't hesitate. Then we start tomorrow. That night, Luke sat at the kitchen table under a single bulb. He reread the grant rejection, then pulled out a fresh application. If Ash could prove himself, if Sierra could ride, they'd have a story. And stories, when true, were powerful. The house was quiet, but there was movement outside. Sierra was in the shed with Ash, humming again, brushing his coat until it gleamed like silver smoke. She knew what people said, that she was just a kid, that wild things couldn't be tamed, that justice didn't always come through. But she also knew what she'd seen in Ash's eyes. He hadn't given up yet. Neither would she. The morning of the dust run broke over the Nevada hills like a fistful of embers tossed into the sky. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the dirt roads outside Dry Creek were already humming with engines, hoofbeats, and the low, eager murmurs of cowboys, ranch hands, and wild horse watchers from all corners of the desert. This was no formal competition. It was older, raw, and fueled by legacy more than law. No permits, no polished arenas. Just open land, rugged tradition, and unspoken rules passed down like folklore. Sierra stood beside Ash at the edge of a wide, open canyon floor, marked with rough wooden posts and colored rags flapping in the wind. Her boots felt 2 sizes too big that morning, and her fingers trembled as she adjusted the makeshift halter. Ash had never run a race in his life, and she had never ridden one. But the moment her hand met his shoulder, his head leaned into her chest. That alone was enough to try. Luke approached from the truck, carrying something in a folded, weathered sleeve, a faded ribbon, and a cracked plastic envelope. Inside was a document aged like tea-stained parchment. Her mother's heritage bloodline certificate listing rare Mustang lineage traced to a federal preserve. The seal was still intact. He hadn't found it earlier in any drawer. It had been pressed between the pages of an old training manual her mother had written, tucked inside a wooden trunk he hadn't dared open in years. It wasn't just proof. It was the past reaching forward like a ghost to help. He handed it to Sierra without a word. She looked at the certificate, then at Ash, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe this isn't just about saving him. Luke nodded. Maybe it's about remembering who your mama was too. They were interrupted by a voice that cut through the early morning murmur like a whip crack. Well, I'll be. Doyle Hanser had arrived, flanked by two local ranchers and his ever-present scowl. He wore a black hat too wide for his head and boots too clean for someone who claimed to work land. He looked at Ash like he was already loading him into a trailer. "You sure you want to do this, little girl?" He sneered. "That horse doesn't have the blood for this, and you don't have the legs." Sierra's jaw set. "She's got more heart than you ever did," came a voice from behind the crowd. It was Elias Briggs, an older black cowboy with greying dreadlocks tied into a bandana and deep creases around his eyes. He'd once been a famous endurance rider before a rodeo accident shattered his ankle. Now he coached kids and helped train skittish horses no one else would touch. Elias didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. Elias stepped forward and patted Ash's flank. Horse knows when someone sees him for what he is, and that one, he pointed at Sierra, ain't here to lose. Sierra gave a grateful nod. She didn't know him, but his words sank deeper than she could say. The riders gathered at the starting line 6 in total. Most were grizzled men with thick gloves and sunburnt necks. Their horses were bigger, bulkier, seasoned for long desert rides. Ash looked small in comparison, leaner, quieter, but his eyes no longer carried the emptiness they once did. Sarah Lorne arrived just before the race began, wearing jeans, a leather vest, and a lopsided grin. "He's strong," she told Sierra, "but this won't be about speed. It'll be about rhythm." Sierra nodded, then climbed onto Ash's back, not with a saddle, not even a blanket. Just trust. The starter, a wiry woman named Patsy Bell, raised her hand with a red cloth. "One lap around the canyon ridge," she shouted. "No interference, no shortcuts, and no complaints when the dust clears. You win, you keep what's yours." A beat of silence. Then the cloth dropped. The ground exploded beneath them. The herd of horses surged forward like a thunderclap, hooves hammering the canyon earth, dust rising in thick clouds. Sierra leaned low, hands on Ash's shoulders, whispering through the roar. Ash responded, not instantly, not like a trained racer, but he found her rhythm, her breath, her balance. They moved like a single body, the way her mother's tapes had always described, not commanding, but connecting. At the first bend, two horses jostled for space, and one rider cursed loudly, falling back. Ash stayed center-left, his gait steady, lungs working harder. Sweat formed along his flanks, but his eyes stayed sharp. Halfway through, Sierra's leg cramped. She gritted her teeth and pushed lower into his neck. "I'm here," she whispered. As they approached the final stretch, the front two riders began to pull away. One was Doyle's man-buck Teeler, a thick-necked bruiser with a reputation for dirty tricks. He glanced back, saw Sierra gaining, and veered slightly, kicking dust into her eyes. Ash blinked rapidly, stumbled, but didn't break stride. That was all Sierra needed to believe. She clicked her tongue once, her heart pounding in her throat. "Go, Ash, go!" He did. With a sudden burst, Ash surged forward, neck even with Buck's, then ahead. The crowd leaned over the railings. Luke's fingers clenched white on the fence. Sarah held her breath. At the last marker, a post, wrapped in red tape ash, thundered past first. Dead silence. Then cheers. Sierra slid off and landed hard on her knees, lungs gasping, hands shaking. Ash turned back to nudge her gently, as if to say, "You okay?" The answer was in her tears. Judge Everett Lane, who'd been among the crowd quietly observing, stepped forward and picked up the certificate from Luke's hand. He examined it, nodded slowly, and looked at Doyle, who was already storming off without a word. "You've got more than enough proof now," the judge said, voice calm. Later that night, as the sun set behind the canyon walls, Sierra fed Ash a cold apple from the cooler. Luke sat beside her, the certificate now framed above the mantel. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They had earned something no piece of paper could ever replace. The wind rolled gently across the dry creek valley, stirring the tall grass and sending tiny whirlwinds spinning through the canyon dust. A warm orange glow poured across the land as the sun dipped toward the western ridgeline. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel slower, softer, like the land itself was finally exhaling. Sierra Mayfield stood at the edge of the field behind her house, her boots buried in the cool dirt. Ash stood beside her, head low, eyes half closed. His coat shimmered in the fading light, still the color of smoke, but now brushed and clean, no longer the matted shell he'd once been. A fresh red ribbon was tied around his neck, fluttering in the wind like a medal from a forgotten war. The dust had settled from the dust run, both literally and metaphorically. After Ash's stunning victory, the atmosphere in Dry Creek had shifted. The people who once whispered that Sierra was just a child now stopped her on the street with respectful nods or quiet praise. Even Sheriff Colby Reams, normally reserved, had given her a gentle pat on the shoulder at the feed store and said, "You made us all proud, kid." More importantly, Doyle Hanser had vanished from public life almost overnight. Rumors had spread fast after Judge Lane received a tip, an anonymous envelope with photos showing multiple wild horses kept illegally on Doyle's ranch. The sheriff and Bureau of Land Management were already investigating. Doyle hadn't returned to the town council meetings since. No one asked Sierra if she was the tipster. She didn't say a word. Meanwhile, Luke Mayfield was a man transformed. After submitting both the video footage of Sierra's training with Ash and the heritage certificate from his late wife, his revised grant application had been reviewed and fast-tracked. That morning, a thick envelope arrived from Carson City. Inside was approval, not just for emergency funding to repair the barn and shed, but also a long-term contract to host a Mustang rehabilitation pilot program. Luke had stood there reading the letter under the porch light, one hand shaking slightly. Then, for the first time in years, he'd let out a quiet laugh. Their small farm, once nothing more than sagging fences and past-due bills, had been given a second life. Later that day, Sarah Lorne stopped by with her ever-present clipboard and her signature crooked smile. She brought with her a small cake wrapped in wax paper and a hand-drawn certificate that read, "Ash, Mustang of the Year." "I made it myself," she said, handing it to Sierra. "Clinic's low on printer ink." Sierra grinned and hugged her, the certificate bending slightly between them. Sarah had changed too, less guarded now, more willing to linger and laugh. Since the race, she'd begun organizing a small riding program for kids with trauma, offering the Mayfield's land as a potential training ground. Sometimes, she'd told Luke, the land heals better when it's full of voices again. As twilight deepened, Elias Briggs rode up slowly on a chestnut mare named Loma. He always came in silence, like he belonged more to the shadows than the day. He was carrying a leather-bound journal and a roll of something under his arm.
"You two are starting something here,"
he said to Sierra and Luke as he dismounted. He handed the journal to Sierra. Inside were handwritten notes, strategies, philosophy, training methods, all collected from old cowboys and wild horse trainers, many now gone. "I used to keep this for me," Elias said, "but I think it's meant for you now." Sierra ran her fingers over the cracked spine. "Thank you," she whispered. Then he passed the roll to Luke. It was an old map of trail routes and unmarked land corridors where Mustangs were still spotted. Places that needed care, protection, and perhaps, someday, stewardship. "You've got space now," Elias said, "and the government's attention. Use it." After Elias rode off into the dusk, Sierra brought Ash down to the canyon one last time that evening. The moon had begun to rise, silver and watchful. The cliffs cast long shadows, and the wind was quiet. Sierra didn't ride him at first. She just walked alongside him, hand resting on his neck. No words, no whispers, just steps. Then, slowly, she climbed onto his back. Ash didn't move. He just waited. Then, without a signal, he began to trot easy, rhythmic down the familiar trail. She rode him through the canyon, across the creek bed now dry with summer, and up the long ridge that overlooked the Mayfield property. From there, the house looked smaller than it ever had. But the light inside glowed bright. It wasn't survival anymore. It was home. Sierra exhaled and closed her eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't afraid of losing something. Ash stopped at the crest of the hill and stood still, his ears forward, eyes wide, breathing calm. The sun was almost gone now, just a faint line of fire behind the ridges. Sierra leaned down and whispered into his ear, "You brought us back." And somewhere, in that quiet evening air, it felt like the whole valley listened. Sometimes what's broken just needs someone to believe again. Sierra didn't have much, just $5 and a heart full of hope, but she gave everything to save a forgotten soul. And in return, that soul helped heal a family, a farm, and a future. In our own lives, we often pass by things that seem too broken, too lost, or too far gone. But maybe, just maybe, they're waiting for someone like you to stop, to care, and to choose love over fear. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if you were Sierra? And if you believe in the power of redemption, of family, and of God's quiet miracles, comment Amen below to stand with us in faith. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories that bring light, hope, and truth into the world. May God bless you and guide your steps always.